Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras, and I'm here with my co-host, James Majewski. Hello, James.
Hello, Thomas. Hello, everybody else.
So today, yet another momentous occasion. Really, every episode of this podcast is momentous in its own way, but today is our first day ever doing a listener request in the film we're discussing. Back now, it's been a while. It took us a while to get to it, so I'm not sure if this person even is a listener of this podcast anymore. But back in like November, somebody commented on one of our videos and said, "Hey, I listened to your episode with Elizabeth Lev on Ben-Hur. Why don't you have her on to discuss the Agony and the Ecstasy?" And I thought, well, we like talking to Elizabeth Lev. And I just really liked that this guy knew not only what film he wanted to hear, but he knew exactly what guest he wanted to hear it discussed with. So I said, yes, we will do that. So that was William Knox who requested this. So William, I hope you're happy we're doing this. Anybody else can, of course, feel free to request, in the YouTube comments or by email, Twitter, whatever, and we'll consider doing films that people request us discussing. So, but to sweeten the deal, I decided I would add on a second movie also about Michelangelo. For people who don't know, The Agony and the Ecstasy is a film about Michelangelo from 1965. And there's a more recent film called Sin, Il Peccato in Italian, directed by Andrei Konchalovsky, who I'll talk about a little bit later. But it came out in 2019 and it sounded interesting, so I decided we'd throw that in there and be interesting to compare two different movies about this artist. So it turns out they take quite different approaches, and they deal with slightly different periods of his life too. So that's kind of interesting as well. So we're very happy to have on, as I mentioned, Elizabeth Lev. Welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you, William, for this great idea. This has been fun research.
Yeah, well, of course, we're having you on. I'm sure William requested you for the same reasons that you are an art historian and a tour guide living in Rome. And I've had you on the Catholic Culture podcast a couple times we talked about art dealing with St. Anthony, and we also did a more recent episode about your book, The Silent Night, which is about St. Joseph in art history. So people should definitely check that out as well. But then we had you on this podcast to talk about Ben-Hur. Now, I guess let me just give a brief introduction of these two films. So The Agony and the Ecstasy, a lot of people have probably heard of this film. 1965, directed by Carol Reed, who's best known probably for The Third Man, a film I must confess I have not seen, but a classic noir film with Orson Welles. The Agony and the Ecstasy stars Charlton Heston as Michelangelo and Rex Harrison, who I have always loved, as Pope Julius II. And it's sort of about their contentious relationship in the commissioning and execution of the Sistine Chapel and sort of all of the politics and the money that gets mixed into it. Now, Sin from 2019 is directed by Andrei Konchalovsky, and Konchalovsky is this sort of old guard Russian film director. He's kind of a national treasure. In fact, Putin, last time he met with Pope Francis, which must have been like 2019 or 2020, he gave Pope Francis a DVD of this film and recommended that he screen it. So I don't know if Pope Francis has actually seen the film, but Konchalovsky is this very valued Russian national treasure. And it's very, very interesting because Konchalovsky, none of whose films I've seen before as a director, but he co-wrote the film Andrei Rublev with Andrei Tarkovsky 50 years ago. And he actually said that Sin is sort of a continuation of those themes.
That's so interesting.
Even not just thematically, but there's a lot of plot points in this that are very similar. Actually,
yeah. If you hadn't,
to Andrei Rublev.
I'm now recalling that you had mentioned that to me, but I forgot that bit of trivia, and even if you hadn't mentioned it, this film feels very reminiscent of Andrei Rublev.
And Andrei Rublev, of course, we discussed on this podcast. It's on the Vatican film list. Elizabeth, have you seen that?
I did. I actually saw it upon your recommendation. It was a very intense film.
Yeah. It definitely benefits from a second viewing because it's so like vignette structured that it's easier to see how everything connects on the second. But yeah, I love that.
But I do get the bell casting scene and the
totally,
and also the marble scene,
and also both of them don't show the artist actually making things
ever. Yeah, that's confusing to me.
Yeah,
guys, we should be doing this while we're recording.
Yeah, no, we are recording. Confusing. We're still recording.
Oh, we are.
Yeah, okay. Because our session kept going.
The idea making movies about artists in which they don't make art, it was a little puzzling to me. But you know what I did think was interesting, since I've missed like 15 minutes of this conversation, I'm just going to insert myself in it.
We haven't been talking. It's
one
okay.
of the things
just for the viewers, if I can explain, Elizabeth had to switch apps because we were having connection problems, so that's why things look a little bit different from how they did a second ago. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
And of course, you would think that this would be normal when I'm doing this from Italy, but I'm doing this from the U.S. of A. So I'm very confused about how I thought I was totally on the tech train.
Different regime.
There we go. There we go. Things have changed.
Thanks, Biden.
So I did.
As they used to say.
We can blame him for everything. Just kidding. But there is a point I want, something I thought was really interesting. Both movies start with St. Peter's, although one is more hidden and the other one is more overt. I mean, the Agony and the Ecstasy starts with this long pan talking about St. Peter's and the greatness of the church. I mean, you're looking around, not at the Sistine Chapel, but really at the Basilica of
There's
St.
like
Peter.
a mini documentary to introduce people to his work before they get into this smaller section of his career that the movie focuses on.
Well, it really seems to be really much more of a, let's just talk about St. Peter's. And then from there, he hones in on that very small chapel next to it. So it's his great project of the Basilica, but it really doesn't, it doesn't really take into account things like David. It's funny. It's not, it just kind of, it focuses the attention on the fact that we are at the seat of the papacy. And that's a really cool thing about the movie, because it's something that I don't think could get made today, given the amount of focus on the meaning of the papacy and the meaning of the faith and the meaning of how we serve God and the amount of times that God is mentioned. It's really quite striking. But if you notice in the opening scene of Sin, you have the Michelangelo who's trudging down the road, and it's hard to see it, but I went back several times and finally realized, because it's picking up from the last scene, it's the same first and last scene, and you can see just kind of he's holding something that's covered with a cloth, and there's a little bit of the cloth that's removed, and you can see in one shot that he's actually carrying the model of St. Peter.
Oh, so great catch!
St. Peter's brackets. St. Peter's brackets the movies, or like opens both movies. They kind of really telescope to his great project, and while I think the Agony and the Ecstasy really focuses on the Sistine Chapel as a great project, I think Sin is really telescoping more towards St. Peter's as Michelangelo's great project.
Interesting. Yeah, that is interesting, especially because he's not, he's working on the chapel a little bit, or you see the end of his work on the chapel, in Sin. Basically, you see the part where they kick him out, and tear down his scaffolding, which is a great scene. And then the rest of the movie, it deals with kind of this tension between the two rival families, the Della Rovere family of Pope Julius II and the Medici family of Pope Leo X. And they're both trying to get Michelangelo to work on projects. In particular, Michelangelo is supposed to be working on the tomb of Julius II, which I happened to see. I was in Italy in July, and I saw most of the works, in these films, which is cool. I didn't know about this tomb before, and I was just going to St. Peter in Chains in Rome to see the Chains of Peter, and not really knowing about the Michelangelo part of it, where this unfinished tomb project ended up. It was supposed to be this huge sculptural group with 48 sculptures, and he only ended up making a few, and the big one is the one of Moses. But what I didn't realize is, like, as they keep saying in the Agony and the Ecstasy, this tomb was supposed to be in the middle of St. Peter's under the nave, which I think we can all be grateful that it's not, because that wouldn't be very appropriate. But So in Sin, he's being fought over by these two families, and he's basically just trying to get by, trying to just get some work done, trying to get the money he needs, trying to get the marble he needs, and maybe not. Maybe cutting some corners, to get things done from time to time, and leaving other people in the dust. So it's interesting because it's almost like it picks up in terms of the timeline, even though they're completely different movies. The timeline of it sort of picks up from the Agony, the Ecstasy, which is nice.
Yeah, I watched Agony and the Ecstasy first, and then I watched Sin, and I just thought, man, this is like a really great double feature,
right?
Because the sense of continuity is so strong.
Yeah.
And you even have characters that are featured in Agony and the Ecstasy making appearances in Sin. So, like, for example, this like Medici family that he's close to in Agony and the Ecstasy, is also playing a really prominent role in Sin, but kind of in different ways. And you can sort of get two pictures of this political element. One that's maybe a little more tamely presented in Agony and the Ecstasy, and then another that's maybe a little more cynically presented in Sin. But that's not the only sort of instance of like a fruitful contrast or fruitful dialogue between the two films. We could talk about, some more examples of that, but I just thought for a double feature, this actually worked really nicely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. But
I think, first of all, I'm sorry I missed you while you were in Rome. I was in South and Puglia, but I was following your adventures on Twitter.
Nice,
I wished
nice.
I could have taken you around to see some of the stuff. But I would say there are contrasts also in that Agony and the Ecstasy is what the Italians call an Americanata.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's everybody. I mean, there was nothing I loved more than the skin tight, like the almost like Marvel outfit that Michelangelo wears in it, like with like the muscles showing in the tights, and then like the cool Stuart Wiseman boots, kind of tromping around. And Rex Harrison, oh my gosh, I mean, he looked like he looked like Nick Fury. So
he's had a beard and everything else I've
it-
seen him in. I was surprised to see him clean shaven for this, especially since Julius II had a beard, and he does have a beard in Sin. So I was like, oh, I guess this just wasn't the era for beards.
He grows the beard. Theoretically, he would have had the beard. He should have had the beard towards the end of the movie, because he grows the beard because as a vow that he won't he won't shave until he's kicked the French off Italian soil in his absolutely fabulous armor outfit. I mean, his clothes were spectacular.
Yeah.
So it was a total Americanata, right down to like the totally made up, love story with Contessina but I mean, it's great. It's in the midst of something that looks so almost Disneylandish. It really had very serious meditations about, what it means to work in a sacred space, what it means to be called for something. So in many ways, it had something very sort of authentic and true amidst, the obvious. It was like in the Ben-Hur 10 Commandments kind of glitzy stamp.
Where did you find him?
Behind the lines, Your Holiness. He was trying to get
Dragged
through.
me here like a criminal. Silence!
I tell you, I was coming to see you.
Where were you?
Carrara, the quarries.
Doing what?
Thinking.
All this time in Carrara, thinking.
I decided that your ideas for the Sistine are unworthy.
In Carrara at the quarries, you've been thinking my ideas are unworthy of your talent.
And of your chapel, Holiness. I completed one panel, part of another.
I saw.
You saw they were poor.
Not in my judgment.
And your judgment's not mine.
Oh, yours is superior to mine, my son.
In matters of art, yes, Holy Father. The wine was sour. I threw it out. Let me show you, Holiness.
Holiness, the enemy's found our range.
Will you give the order to open fire?
This is the sacrifice of Noah. And this is the flood. Yes. And that's the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. The creation of Adam, the sun, the moon, Genesis.
Covering the entire ceiling, not just the side panels as you planned. You see, this is my plan for the whole work. Now, spacing the central panels will be the pagan symbols and the Hebrew prophets who foresaw the coming of Christ, and below, the ancestors of Christ.
An appropriate design.
No appropriate designs. I'm not a decorator, Holiness. With your permission, I'll cover the entire vault with glory.
Your Holiness, the men are in position to attack. We must move now.
How much time?
Well, several months, perhaps a year. It's 5 times as much work.
And cost, I suppose.
It won't be cheap.
Well, I'm in a mood to be generous, Buonarroti. I will double your grant. 4,000 ducats.
For 5 times the work?
It's all I can afford. It costs me more to paint a ceiling than lay siege to a city.
I should have at least 10,000, Holy.
I'll give you 5, 8, 6,000 ducats. My last word. Would you bargain with your pontiff?
Sin presents a very different look, and that is not an Americanata. That's very much this the almost the antithesis. And
well, he said Konchalovsky said he was influenced by
inaccuracies.
Italian neorealism, like Rossellini and Vittorio
Exactly,
De Sica and that
it
kind of
is
stuff.
evident. It's evident he's influenced by Italian neorealism, and I think he also said things. He wants you to be able to smell his films. Apparently, what he means by that is that you're never allowed to smell anything nice in his films because as you feel like you can smell his films.
No, there's a great.
You feel like you really.
There's a great behind the scenes, like 40-minute behind the scenes featurette I found on Vimeo for Sin, and it's fascinating. Like all the things you learn. For example, all these stonemasons they got were like actual miners and stonemasons that they cast in this movie. But one of the things is you see the like set decorators like sprinkling various animal manures around the streets because he wanted to just, even though you can't actually smell it, he just wanted it to be like part of the thing, you know. So this is a very realistic, gritty. Rome and Florence and Carrara, you know, that we're seeing in this movie.
You know, tonally, it also reminded me of Andrei Rublev, and it's sort of like there's like a bleakness to the landscape and to these the atmosphere, you know, that hangs over these villages and taverns, and everybody's just kind of a little down in the dumps,
but gorgeous photography, gorgeous landscape.
Definitely,
the photography was beautiful. It is true, but it is two totally different color schemes. So you have, and remember, they're different periods. So you have this sort of excitement of being able to have these huge pans when they're making Agony and the Ecstasy. There's like a whole different moment happening in cinema where they're like, look how wide we can get our camera, and filling up the space with color. It's really the possibilities and what one can do with color. They're very excited about that, and that comes out in the film, and it's very exuberant, it's very happy. In this case, the camera, it's shot much more closely. It's shot in it's a much tighter box. So you're kind of you're looking through a very, very specific lens.
It's got a lot of like still photography like moments. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's crisply beautiful. It's got a color palette, which is like a Giorgio Morandi painting, sort of very soft. The contrasts aren't very great. And in doing so, I mean, he does actually, as everybody says, he does end up making the monster block almost like it's a protagonist. And really the only place where the camera actually bothers to open up is when the camera tries to encompass the size of the giant block of marble that for some reason Michelangelo is fixated on, which is okay, whatever. This movie, the Sin movie, is like in the back of my head, I just keep calling it like Michelangelo, the missing years. And there is a kind of a weird thing that happens when he finishes the Sistine Chapel and Julius II dies, and he gets shipped off to do this San Lorenzo project by the Medicis, who I have a theory didn't like him very much, and he gets shipped off to do this task, and we don't hear from him for several years, and he doesn't really produce anything, and so this movie kind of explores that void.
Ma come si fa a ritrarre il scorcio se con il naso tu tocchi il soffitto? Puoi soltanto immaginare che effetto farà a quelli che stanno sotto. Un altro anno. Mi serve ancora un altro anno. C'è da rifare tutto. Non ho finito, non vi faccio passare.
Michelangelo, è un anno che continui a ripetere la stessa cosa. Sua Santità ti aveva avvertito, prima a Natale, poi a Pasqua. Ora il Papa ha perso la pazienza. A mezzogiorno verrà qui con un intero conclave per vedere la cappella e la commissione deve vedere il tuo lavoro prima dell'arrivo del pontefice. Facci passare.
No.
Michelangelo, la Santa Inquisizione è responsabile nei confronti del Papa del contenuto religioso degli affreschi. Non ci siamo scordati i guai con l'affresco del Paradiso, dove Eva punta con il naso i coglioni di Adamo. Ancora adesso non posso alzare lo sguardo al soffitto. Facci strada.
Ma non è male. Eppure al Papa era piaciuta. Allora vuol dire che lui di me si fida e l'Inquisizione no.
L'Inquisizione non si fida di nessuno e proprio per questo ci chiamano domenicani. Domini canes.
Domini cagne.
Ma come ti permetti di parlare in questa maniera alla Santa Inquisizione? Levati di mezzo.
No, è ubriaco. Michelangelo, facci passare.
No. Voi non potete decidere se ho finito il lavoro o no.
Raffaello, dove sei?
Raffaello.
Qui, Vostra Eminenza.
Raffaello, di cui il Papa ha la massima fiducia. Dice che è salito sul ponteggio, ha controllato, è tutto a posto, tutto pronto.
Raffaello.
Michelangelo, non potevo dire di no a Sua Santità e non potevo neanche negarmi il piacere di essere il primo a vedere tutta la tua opera.
Vergognati!
No, basta, smettetela, su, avanti.
Fermi!
Bene, entrate e cominciate a demolire il ponteggio.
Fermi! Andate via! Andate via, lo butto giù io tutto questo!
Finite di smontare il ponteggio entro mezzogiorno!
Scendete giù!
Michelangelo!
Fermi! Lo butto giù io!
Lavati!
No! Lo butto giù io tutto questo infanto ponteggio! Maledetti, fermi! Dove andate? Lo butto giù io! Potete precipitare! Fermi!
Michelangelo! Papa ha dato ordine di buttarti giù dal ponteggio! Michelangelo, vai a dormire e torna a mezzogiorno per incontrare il pontefice!
Sì, io non sono e finalmente me ne potrò andare da questa città di pellegrini e puttani! Tu, sei stato tu a convincere il Papa a smontare il ponteggio!
No, Michelangelo.
E ora vieni qui per ridermi in faccia!
Michelangelo, ma che stai dicendo?
Sei tu! Sei tu! Che rubi l'idea da me! Da Leonardo! Da Perugino! Non è nessuna idea tua!
Ma è vero, rubo solo da te! Michelangelo, dai, aspetta! Michelangelo, fermati! Tu il migliore, io ti stimo!
Vattene! Vattene! Ladro! Vai sempre in giro con il tuo leccaculo!
E tu sei sempre solo come un boia! Pazzo! È pazzo!
Sì, ma è proprio impazzito. No, è sempre stato così. Ed è sempre così sporco.
The other thing that this movie is based on, and things that Irving Stone didn't have when he wrote The Agony and the Ecstasy, which is why there are many factual errors, that and the fact that he was just telling a fiction story. But there's another very important thing that's happened, which is the reading of Michelangelo's what are called ricordi. And the ricordi are they're books, as in like accounting books. They're books where you keep kind of the numbers of what you're paid, what you're not paid, what you shell out. And they become kind of like diaries, and they found Michelangelo's ricordi, and you can see that's heavily influenced. I mean, that's pretty much what's driving the movie is this understanding of Michelangelo's sort of, careful accounting of where he put money out, where he put money in. And the fact that the opening scene, after this sort of penitential Michelangelo walking to Rome, holding this mysterious thing, talking about how horrible Florence is, the next scene is about him wheelie dealing and sort of taking advantage and clearly understanding that he's about to use money that's destined for something else to make a clever, business move in Florence. So that comes a lot from the Michelangelo who emerges from these Book of Ricordi, where we see a man who was concerned about making sure he amassed money for his family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I have to say, interesting contrast between the two performances, too. We've got Alberto Testone as Michelangelo in Sin and Charlton Heston as Michelangelo in The Agony and the Ecstasy. I have to say, the character of Michelangelo in Sin it should be less likable, but I actually found the performance more endearing than Charlton Heston's performance. Strangely, Rex Harrison made me like him more as the corrupt Pope Julius II than Charlton Heston, endeared me as Michelangelo in The Agony and the Ecstasy. I don't know if you felt that way, but
I don't know how corrupt Julius comes across as being. He comes across as being a person who's. I agree with you. I mean, I think that Charlton Heston is.
He comes across as being worldly. Then, yeah.
Well, he's very worldly, yes. But this is the Renaissance papacy, and they are worldly. Interesting. Remind me to get to the contrast between the two Leos, with the cardinal who will be Pope Leo X, and then the way Leo X is portrayed. Because I was like, whoa. But but I do agree with you that. That the Charlton Heston character is just another one. It's Charlton Heston, right? It's like Captain America plays. I mean, he's great, but he's fun, but it's not obviously not a nuanced portrayal. Whereas Rex Harrison comes across as being this great swaggering Julius II, and you want to love him, and he's so adorable, like kind of popping his head up, and then he becomes vulnerable towards the end of the movie when you begin to see him aging, and it's hard for him to climb up those steps, and yet his commitment to this project, and even the way that he's a little wiser than Michelangelo because he knows how to play him to get him to work. So the relationship. I think the acting of Rex Harrison really carried most of that relationship. The actor who played Alberto Testone, right? Yeah, he looks like Michelangelo. We have a drawing. There's a drawing by Daniele da Volterra, which is done from life. It's a sketch, which was done when Michelangelo was 40, and that guy looks just like that drawing. And he is very indie. He's a magnificent actor. And the way he sort of crinkles up his face and sort of the big eyes and then the mischievous expression and then the furtive expression.
He's like a hobo. He's like a lovable hobo.
It's amazing. And he carries the movie, I think.
Yeah,
He carries the movie single-handedly because the characters, the papacy characters are just... They're caricatures, and the Leo X is just sort of revolting, and the Clement VII who can't have a conversation without checking out the girl in the back of the room. I mean, it's exactly the opposite from Agony and the Ecstasy.
So who's that? Clement VII? You said
the future Clement VII is the Medici cardinal. It's Giuliano de' Medici, he's the future Clement VII. He's the one who will be Pope within the interim of Hadrian IV between Leo X and it's a very sort of a tired and cynical and
right. And there is no other character who's a match for Michelangelo in this movie, like Rex Harrison is a match for Charlton Heston in The Agony and the Ecstasy. The Sin is really dominated by Michelangelo, and everybody else is sort of in the background. Nobody else is fleshed out in that way, like there's a lot of characters who are fun to watch, like the miners and stuff, but none of them is really a fleshed out character. They have personality, but they function more as like a group,
right.
So
the Marchese of Carrara had, I think, great possibilities for such such a remarkable character, the one who owns the house where Dante had stayed.
Yes.
And so he's I think he only has 2 scenes in the movie, but every single time he shows up, you get the compelling gravitas that actually starts to propel the story forward a little bit.
Now this film makes a lot of Sin makes a lot of Michelangelo's connection that he felt with Dante as being sort of the only artist that he could relate to. Which was very interesting because they have this whole scene where he's sleeping in the room where Dante slept, and then he goes, climbs up the mountain at night, and he's reciting the Inferno, which he apparently had memorized. We're told in the film, and then at the end, of course, he has a vision of Dante. This film we haven't mentioned. It's got we mentioned the neo-realist aspects, but it's also got these surreal aspects. Which were organized, that the director described as being a film that's, rather than being a biopic, it's like organized, it's like based on visions, so some of them you're not sure if it's real or not. Like he has this vision of Pope Julius dying, but there's like an angel by his bedside, and then he wakes up and he's like, Pope Julius is dying. So we almost see this mystical side of Michelangelo. He's haunted by the devil. He's seeing things. He's attacked by dogs in the streets that he thinks are devils at one point. And then there's this whole crazy thing at the end where, the young couple is murdered, and I wasn't even sure at first, like, did that really happen? You know what I mean?
Yes, I thought
kind of hope that it didn't happen.
Right.
Yeah, that was the story began to it kind of went a little off the rails in that moment.
Right.
Also, I mean, the story itself is a little specious. There's a lot of artistic license happening in this move from Carrara to Pietrasanta and the gangs and the this and the that. But then, of course, the whole made up thing about Contessina and Michelangelo being infatuated with a Medici daughter. That's pretty far-fetched too. But on the whole, I mean, I thought it was an interesting. I really appreciated when I first saw the movie, called Sin. I was thinking, oh, for heaven's sakes, I can't take this if it's going to be about Michelangelo's sexuality. Right. But the director really correctly identified where Michelangelo's real sins are. As a matter of fact, it's sort of interesting that the 2 moments of like sex that take place around him, he's indifferent. He's not interested. But his what calls to him, his 2 problems are avarice and pride. And they both say them very clearly. Avarice is a sin, pride is a sin, and that the final scene shows him, wearing basically a Franciscan sort of penitent's outfit, carrying his reparation, which will be, of course, St. Peter's, which he does for no money. He does it as an act of reparation. I think Dante taking him through that journey of where his sins lead in order to eventually bring him out into the light of finding something. The St. Peter's task isn't for his own glory. And I think going back to what you said earlier about that tomb and the way the tomb was supposed to be in St. Peter's Basilica, and it was this huge aggressive thing that would have literally dwarfed or overshadowed the tomb of St. Peter himself. I mean, every time I think about that, every time I talk about it, in the back of my head, I'm thinking, what were you thinking, Michelangelo? Like, how could you possibly think that the Holy Spirit was going to let you get away with that one? So I think it's a really interesting and intelligent foray into what troubled Michelangelo when we have these poems later on in his life when he's so concerned about sin. I very much appreciated that the director brings us back to the real sins of Michelangelo, which was working for Michelangelo and not for God.
Yeah. And we get that sense early that he's concerned about his salvation. You know, there's the scene whenever anybody references, this, he almost like goes and hides. You know, he like physically hides himself, and his family's arguing, and I guess he's got his brother who's become a Dominican and is reading the forbidden writings of the deceased Savonarola, which is, I love those little historical. I mean, it is a caricature totally, but it's also, I just love these little historical references, and so he mentions, oh, you're gonna burn in hell to somebody else, and Michelangelo immediately like flees the room. And it's like, are we really all gonna burn in hell? It's something that he takes very seriously,
I appreciated that a great deal. It's difficult for filmmakers in this period today. Agony and the Ecstasy, obviously, they had to throw in the flirtation, but even so, he's a moral, upright man who's not swayed by sex. But in this historical moment we live in right now, the focus is always on the personal life of the artist, and this artist seems to be really just defined by his or her sexuality, and it just, that's so secondary when it comes to people who are producing works of art for God, for the most sacred spaces in the world. His real problems are much more serious, and that they put those problems back on the top burner where they belong. And I again, that's something that I find. I watched the movie several times over. And going back to specific scenes and specific moments and kind of parsing them out. Really very, very, very interesting.
Yeah, even though it doesn't show him at work much, it does show him working through those obstacles. And it may seem to us that like the issues of money and, who am I going to work with, and, whose commission do I stay with, those may seem secondary and distractions from art, but in the process, like you're suggesting, he is dealing with issues that are very central to what his purpose as an artist is, in that he is allowing himself to be caught up in these somewhat secondary issues instead of sort of just doing what's necessary to get to the work. He's actually losing himself as an artist in the process of trying to just hang on to that at the expense of everything else.
And then the construct of the giant piece of marble, which is clearly, that's like the external manifestation of his ego, right? Like this is like there's a moment there when he's in Ferrara where he talks about how he would like to carve the mountain face into sculptures of giants. There's a story about that, and I think the monster block comes from this. Also, don't forget his willingness to when you think, oh no, he's just caught up in this situation between the two popes, as it were. Don't forget that he's perfectly willing to, stiff his colleagues. I mean, he plays rough, Michelangelo, in this story.
Yeah, like poor Sansovino, he buys out this block of marble that was supposed to be for him, and
right, and takes his job.
Yeah. Yeah. No, did that San Lorenzo facade end up happening? Okay.
Nope. Ended up not happening. Leo X took him off to put him on the San Lorenzo facade. And then after he had brought down all this marble and prepared all this marble and made all these agreements in Carrara, Leo X simply just took him off the project. And that was that. And then soon afterwards, he was on the project of making the Medici tombs in the new sacristy inside the Church of San Lorenzo. It's a very peculiar thing, and it's an interesting. I think this is one take on the story, and it's. Besides the obviously fictitious elements, but it is an interesting missing few years for Michelangelo. And one of the things that I noticed is that the second that Julius II dies, Michelangelo is dispatched back to Florence, kind of to work for the family, but to get out of the hair, I think, of Leo X. And I just have a feeling that they did not get along at all, and that he was sort of sent to Florence, and he was sort of let him grind his heels a bit, and sort of let the kind of the propulsion of fame. He was becoming extremely famous. And sometimes I wonder if this was not intentional, because the Medici were very, very, very clever. If it was not sort of intentional to kind of slow down the momentum of Michelangelo's fame, because the one thing that they do not address in this movie is that Michelangelo is not for the Medici rule of Florence at all. He will fight for the Republic. And there will come a point under Clement VII that Michelangelo's actions can be declared by the Medicis as treasonous, and they choose not to punish him because he's Michelangelo. But they say it on several occasions. You get away with this because you're Michelangelo. And so imagine if he had produced the tomb. Like, who would he be? How could you, he would become unstoppable in many ways. Almost a political figure with the kind of fame he had. Sometimes I just think about the fact that you have such a genius, and they let him languish for all those years doing nothing. And I'm always like, why did you waste the best years of this man's life?
Yeah. The way that this works in the Agony and the Ecstasy, from what I remember, it's more focused on the politics, whereas the politics are part of Sin, but it also brings out the whole cultural fabric of the time. I mean, we're getting references to Boccaccio, Dante, even some pornographic poet of the era is referenced. Aretino, and so all this other stuff is playing into it as well as part. And I appreciated the Dante stuff just because it did show Michelangelo, even though he's an egotist, it did show him as feeling a deep connection with Italy's past and with past masters who went before him. I think it mentions that in one of the films that he studied with Ghirlandaio. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. He did.
Okay.
He studied with Ghirlandaio. I think that's Agony and the Ecstasy that they point out.
Yeah.
He studied with Ghirlandaio for about 2 years, from 13 to 15. And so the irony of that is that Ghirlandaio, in Agony and the Ecstasy, Michelangelo doesn't want to do the ceiling. I'm not a fresco painter. I'm not a painter. Well, come, Michelangelo, you studied with Ghirlandaio, who's one of the painters, the original painters of the Sistine Chapel, which is where the irony lies. He has to paint on top of the work of the person he claims he never learned anything from. And but yes, he studied there. Then the other movie really focuses on this creative struggle to produce the ceiling and the dynamic between patron and painter, whereas I think Sin really shows the flip side of the relationship between patron and painter, because Michelangelo and Julius II, for all of their arguing and fighting, their relationship is incredibly powerful, and it's part of what spurs Michelangelo. In Sin, we see the relationship with the patrons is tearing him apart and actually making him unable to work. So it's sort of like two different versions of what it means to be, maybe it's the difference between a studio-driven movie, Patron, and an art house film.
Yeah. Well, there is that powerful moment at the beginning of Sin when he meets with Julius, who has just seen the Sistine Chapel, and he sort of falls to his knees before him, but then he raises him up, and Michelangelo collapses on him in tears, it's like he's overwhelmed by the effort that he's been making, but also it means a lot to him to have the Pope is still a religious figure to him, which is nice. You do get that impression that even amidst all of the problems and his knowledge and his resentment of the Pope, and the whole situation in Italy, the Pope remains a religious figure for Michelangelo, and it still is very powerful for the Pope to approve his work.
I thought that was something nice about both films, and that Michelangelo as a devout figure really comes across, in different ways, and he's not perfect. He's not a saint in either film, but that this religious aspect isn't just to his work isn't just something that he has to put up with because of his relationship with the church as a patron, and it's not ever ironic or anything like that.
His sense of the discrepancy between the subject matter of his work and the people he's doing the work for on Earth, is there in the same way that it is with Andrei Rublev. And that's one of the big themes is this, we talked about this when we discussed Andrei Rublev, like the that you're doing religious work, but your patrons are often commissioning it for vain, motives. And that's very much present in both films. And there's this line where he says in Sin, all this beauty for some whoremongers, tyrants, and assassins, so it's explicitly acknowledged that he's seeing this as somewhat absurd at the very least.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that both films, in dealing with this like titanic artistic figure, choose to really sort of zero in on this like symbiotic relationship that an artist has with his patrons or with, like a broader marketplace or industry or whatever you want to call it. Because that's certainly not the case with a lot of other artistic biopics that we see. So yeah, I don't know, just
well, it's
something
very interesting because
about
Konchalovsky has a patron. Well, Konchalovsky's been around forever. I mean, he worked under communism and has worked under capitalism, and he has a patron. He has a Russian oligarch who is his guy. This tycoon Alisher Usmanov is his patron for his movies. So like, he's experienced this old school patronage relationship, in our time, which is quite interesting, as a subtext as well.
It is interesting. The one thing I did think was wildly off was when I went looking for God in Sin at the end, when Dante comes in this final visionary scene. I think the movie stumbles. I went looking for God and I found only man. I don't think that is what he is thinking at all. I don't think the Pietà can be produced from someone who was looking for God and found only man, nor can the Sistine Chapel ceiling. I think it was a cute line, maybe.
He said you can't pray in front of them. He said, I realize you can't pray in front of these works.
And that's the other line that I thought was complete. It's followed by my people do not pray in front of my works and induces them to sinful thoughts. That is, again, incorrect. The Pietà is anything but that.
Now, do you think he's maybe referring to... Didn't he do the Pietà when he was young? So could he be referring specifically to that mid-period that he's sort of going astray in the period of this film?
What he hasn't done the Last Judgment yet, which is where the real issue comes in. David is not a work for prayer. David is a work that's a symbol of the Republic. It goes out in the public square, so it's not a work that anybody's supposed to. People are praying in front of David, but why are you doing that? and the Sistine Chapel ceiling is, again, that's incorrect. It is a place of prayer. It's a place where it was the most solemn place of prayer there was, and I think that was a bit of a facile line that I after watching it a couple of times, I see what he's trying to underscore a Michelangelo who perhaps has been producing art for Michelangelo's sake or art for art's sake, but that's not. It's a little. That's too facile.
Do you think it's more of like a comment on humanism as a whole, or like the Renaissance? Because, you do look at the icon tradition of a Fra, that Fra Angelico is partaking of more, at least somewhat more closely. There's a closer connection between Giotto and the icon tradition than there is between Michelangelo and the icon tradition, where these things are meant exclusively for prayer, specifically for prayer and liturgical use. So is there anything of that that's going on here, especially from a Russian's perspective, maybe?
I wondered how much of this and actually that's why I went back to watch the Rublev movie, because I thought, well, maybe I just need more of the Russians' perspective here. And I do actually think that is a little bit of an issue to not understand. I think there's a little bit of a bias towards Western art being a little bit too much for pleasure than for prayer. And I think that shows in the movie. However, going back to Giotto is just as shocking an artist as Michelangelo. So the Pietà is an altarpiece. When on top of an altar, it was the focal point for the liturgy. And so the Giotto's crucifixion in Santa Maria Novella, where you have an almost nude Christ with a transparent veil around his waist, who is slumped very visibly lifelessly, his body is clearly dead on the cross, is not icon tradition.
Okay.
It's shocking. It's shocking. And so it's shocking the same way the nudes of the Sistine Chapel would have been. Giotto also did Last Judgments, kind of works that aren't necessarily meant for prayer. It went over the entrance and exit of the church, but works that are meant to catch the public up and remind them. So Fra Angelico himself kind of balanced. That's why he's the saint. Giotto's not a saint. Michelangelo's not a saint. But Fra Angelico had this really beautiful balance between the icon tradition, i.e., something that's really meant to focus, channel, and sort of really cultivate prayer, but at the same time using the Western innovations to create space, or I guess what later on the spiritual exercises would call composition of place. He gives you some of that. He gives you a room. He gives you a figure. He gives you a sense of where you are in relation to where the holy story is taking place. So I think I think the problem is more what you were saying afterwards, that this comes from someone whose tradition is accustomed to icons, trying to understand or make sense of a Western tradition where we allow such extraordinary liberty to artists, even though sometimes it means that the artist will produce a work that's more for the artist than for the subject. But then when he gets it right, he really gets it right.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, and that's why Fra Angelico is my favorite of these, these three artists, that we were just talking about, because of the balance between those two elements. I was just in San Marco, and it was incredible. I also did see Giotto's Last Judgment in Padua at the Scrovegni Chapel, which is amazing as well. We also see Raphael in both movies. Pretty similar portrayal, even physically. I'm assuming that's what he must have looked like, since they both portray him with a similar hairstyle and everything.
I think it's in Sin that he uses one of my favorite. I couldn't believe. I think it was Sin. It was using one of my favorite lines between the two of them when they run into each other. And yes, it was Sin, because Raphael's with two people.
Yeah,
and he comes out to kind of be conciliatory with Michelangelo, who's having like one of his hissy fits, and the line about you're always surrounded by people and you're always alone like an executioner. That's a very famous line. It's recounted in his biography.
Oh, really? Wow.
That the two of them ran across each other one day, and Raphael, as usual, was surrounded by people, and they're his friends, and he's so jovial. Michelangelo's by himself. Michelangelo just couldn't shut up. So he ended up being roundly one-upped by Raphael with the "you're alone like an executioner" line.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, so that's another area where these two films overlap, is for all the differences in their portrayal of Michelangelo, you still get a sense of Michelangelo's this sort of misanthropic eccentricity that, in the case of Agony and the Ecstasy, certainly has a glamorized Charlton Heston gloss put over it, and then maybe a little more dingy, muddied up portrayal in Sin. But nevertheless, like, there's this interest in both films with this bizarre, fantastic, crazed quality to Michelangelo.
And James, what was your impression of Alberto Testone's performance? Since you're an actor,
oh my gosh, curious. Yeah, it was so awesome. I mean, he was so physical. He was like an animal in it. Like, there were times when he, like, even just like when he would get out of bed and go like walking through the streets, like the gait, is so distinct. Like, nobody walks this way unless they're an actor who's trying to do something that's like really dramatically like viable, even in just, walking down an alleyway. But like, times when he would, like when he got poisoned and he went to go accuse,
Sansovino.
Yeah. he's sick, he's bowled over, but he's like, angry and intense, and every part of his body is engaged in this
and his
this
eyes
performance.
just like his eyes are so when he's talking, when he's first hanging out with Sansovino at the tavern, and he's telling Sansovino what how terror is, and he's got this demonic grin. His eyes are just like burning.
No, he was amazing. It almost like made an impossible task for some of the other actors, acting alongside him. Like when Sansovino comes to disrupt the wedding festivities, it kind of like there's kind of like a reversal of those scenes. It just like it doesn't feel nearly as captivating or alive. You can tell that the actor is informing the choices that he's making, based on the scene that we've seen prior. It just doesn't have like the same like it doesn't catch you in the same way,
Apparently Testone before this movie had just been through a pretty bad leg injury and sort of like a really physical ordeal, and so he was still he's still actually limping, in the filming of this movie.
Okay, well, there you go.
The physicality of it. It's quite fascinating. I love that they got the elephant in there. Hano, the pet elephant of Leo the Tenth. Now, how did he die again, Elizabeth? It's not shown in this movie.
A gold enema.
So they gave him these enema pills that were like encrusted with gold or something like that, and it killed him.
Yeah, they gave him a gold enema.
That's so sad.
What a way to go!
But yeah, we see this elephant in the film, and everybody in Rome is coming to see it. It's great. Apparently, that's not CG. They brought a real elephant. It's a small elephant. They brought a real elephant to the Villa Giulia in Rome and put him in there to shoot this. And apparently, they had trouble getting him out at the end. He didn't want to leave, but.
Another thing that I liked about both films is the choice to sort of feature a montage of Michelangelo's works. In the case of Agony and the Ecstasy, right at the outset, and then in the case of Sin, much like in Andrei Rublev, as almost like a kind of epilogue, this was another way that these films felt like they really lived very nicely together, because if you watch them back to back or over the course of 2 days, as I did, you have like this whole story bookended by this presentation of his works, this like meditation. And I think it's more effective in Agony and the Ecstasy than in Sin, because to your point, Elizabeth, I think in Sin, the montage of these details, these still images focusing in on different parts of his sculptures, is almost at odds with what he's saying and where the film has us dramatically in that moment, where like this line that you described as being so facile. It's like, well, yeah, I know it's facile because I'm looking at these works of art. They speak for themselves, like they're divine. So it was like an odd, it was an odd thing.
It came off as a weak. I thought that the ending came off as a weak echo of Andrei Rublev. It doesn't have the same impact as the
not
scenes
at all.
of his paintings.
Not at all.
And I think part of the reason for that is because it's somewhat diluted, because it's cut in with him walking. It's not just that. It's not this like long sequence with the music we get with Andrei Rublev, but and it's not like a switch from black and white to color either. It's actually a switch from color to black and white, because the sculptures are just white. But also because that vision scene, it's like, wait, were those people really like? Were they killed?
I'm still worried about those people. Are they dead or not?
And then he's like, and then he has the vision of Dante, and Dante's like, listen, and it's like, okay, so it doesn't hit as hard as like Andrei Rublev finally breaking his vow of silence after that bell is built and speaking to comfort this boy, which is incredibly moving, So yeah, but this film is also much more accessible than Andrei Rublev. I'll at least say that for it.
Also, I think at the end of Andrei Rublev, you've been in like the bell pit and the mud and those horrible wraps on the boys' shoes, which just drove me crazy. I just wanted to go buy everybody's shoes in that movie, and it's just been cold and muddy and awful and dark, black and white and gritty, and then the paintings come in, and you see this little bit, and you're trying to open your eyes wider to make the camera show it to you faster. Like, come on, I want to see it. I want to see it. Like the paintings come, like you understand what sacred art means in these contexts because you're just so sick of the grime, and you are suddenly opened up to this incredible and the noise and the chaos and the wanton cruelty, and then you open up to these scenes that are so peaceful and meaningful. So it really, the way that ends is just it's a relief. It's even a greater relief than the bell actually ringing.
Yeah.
But in the end, the addition of these pictures here, and on top of that, you're like, okay, couldn't we have talked about this before? Why are we talking about this now? But I do like the idea of a person on a journey, which is very much like Dante's own. You start out with he's walking down the road, and Dante starts out mezz cammino della nostra vita. I found myself lost in a dark wood because I had lost the right way. So we understand that Michelangelo, he's following Dante, he too has lost the right way. And interestingly, Dante suffers from similar sins, right? The animals that block his path, pride, avarice. So, and then at the very end, you see him, even though it's the same walk we saw at the beginning, we see him, the way he gazes with that magnificent face, that actor's magnificent face. He's walking along holding his model of St. Peter, and he sees St. Peter already. He sees it underway. So it's I thought maybe if we had not distracted us from this sort of redemptive Michelangelo, or penitent Michelangelo on the road to redemption with these images that didn't really make sense.
Why? Let me ask about this. So this film shows Michelangelo as being paranoid about being assassinated or poisoned or whatever. Was that part of his life? Was that something he was paranoid about?
Yeah, he was. He was actually he was frightened for. It's not unusual. The competitors, there's a lot of paranoia in that world. So, Leonardo's famous, backwards, upside down writing. Michelangelo was afraid that we actually know that he accused Bramante of trying to poison him. So the director simply took it and made it Sansovino to make it more correct with the timeline. But yes, Michelangelo's the sort of person who thought he was being spied on, who thought he was being poisoned. He was perennially angry with his own family members, rightfully so. He was very, very paranoid, outrageously hypochondriac. Yes.
So
I always think of him as he's that guy that, like, when the phone rang, you would be like, oh, I have to get this. Yes, Michelangelo. I know everyone's mad at you. Yes, I know they're trying to kill you. Yes, okay, get back to work. I mean, he was that guy.
So following on that, then, the reason I didn't think the scene at the end, where after the wedding of his assistant with this young woman, he finds them dead and murdered in their room. The reason I didn't think that was real, other than the fact that Dante appears to him in the room and it's just kind of a surreal, experience, is because I couldn't figure out, like, wait, why would they have been killed? Was it like the Syrian assassin guy? I still can't figure out, like, why would people who were mad at Dante for not doing his commission or whatever kill this couple? I still don't know.
Okay. So I spent a lot of time on this one.
Okay.
And I think I've got, like, they prepare us for it, because when the monster block is being brought down, the blacksmith made the imperfect hinges and ended up killing one of the stoneworkers. And then when Michelangelo went to go, tell that guy off, he goes in and the guy's dead.
He's already dead, yeah.
Because the mysterious stoneworkers have taken their revenge. Okay, so now we've been told that Michelangelo has angered them because he's betrayed them, because they're going to lose a lot of money because the marble quarrying is now going to Pietrasanta, but they can't touch Michelangelo or they'll have like the Pope on top of them. So instead, they hurt someone close to him. And remember that he gives the money for her dowry. He pays for her dowry. So he's like he's invested in this couple. And so, I mean, if in fact they're dead, because again, I'm not sure why he's walking into their bedroom.
For the audience, there is a little bit of sex in this movie, so watch out. It's not explicit, but well, let me just ask you, Liz, what do you think of the Agony and the Ecstasy overall? Because I have to say I wasn't that impressed with it as a movie. There were things that were fun about it, but like overall, I kind of felt like, you know, it's kind of talky, you know, it's kind of the way they talk, you know, Michelangelo, his line, God created man with pride, not shame. It was left to the priest to invent shame. You know, that kind of silly stuff. I don't know. What did you think? Is this, do you find it's sort of successful overall in conveying something about Michelangelo?
I actually like it. I do. I agree with you with all the little, you know, I agree with you. It's like I said at the beginning, it's an Americanata. Right. I mean, it's an Americanata made by someone who's a Protestant. Also, I have no clue about how the Catholic Churches works, but it doesn't. At the end of the day, whoever made it or the movie reflects and understands that there is a God and God works through beauty, and all the other silly stuff is silly stuff that helps to keep the audience engaged and interested for an audience that, I'm thinking in terms of a movie that people would actually see and enjoy. Now, we can pick apart Sin, and I actually think it's a very intelligent movie. I disagree with some of the premises, but not many people can, I mean, this is not, if I would like more people to know about Michelangelo, I would not say watch Sin. But I do think, you know, Agony and the Ecstasy could use a reboot, sort of a new version. But I do think that kind of movie, that kind of uplifting, fun, a lot of kind of traipsing around, almost superhero. It's got a feeling like a Marvel movie. Yeah, I think way too many extras, overdressed. It makes it, but I think that kind of movie, I get tired of these angsty movies about artists. It's just not fun, and like, you know, only a few people want to see it. He made beautiful things. He had a beautiful place, and people want to rejoice in it. They want to feel the over the topness of it, and I think that's a great way to introduce people to characters like Michelangelo.
Yeah,
and I appreciate any movie that doesn't get bogged down in the sexuality of the artist, because I get bored out of my mind.
Right. Yeah, I enjoyed a couple things I enjoyed about the Agony of the Ecstasy is, first of all, like just the fact that like Michelangelo is running up to talk to Julius II, like in the midst of like a battle being about to start, and Julius II putting everything aside as people are like, should we fire the cannons? You know, like, and just like laying out the plans.
Oh, that was great.
Which is really fun. And then the boy cardinal, where he's like, we need more money, create another cardinal. And then we cut to this like teenager, and he's just not wearing the hat well, you know. But I also enjoyed the sort of like overblown monologues. I enjoyed the scene with Raphael and Michelangelo in his studio, I think, where Raphael is talking about the relationship between the artist and the patron, and how, you know, the need for patrons, for artists to do what they have to do or die, I think is what he says essentially. So I thought that was, you know, I think a good defense, as good a defense as any of the patronage system, is that, you know, these things cost money and they require resources and they require somebody to give you a space to put the thing, you know, and it created a lot of great things, you know. So. Yeah,
and one thing I'll say about both these films is that, like, anytime you have, you know, like, one thing I had to keep reminding myself is that this is a movie about artists and about art being told by artists, you know, who also are practicing art in their own way. And so it's like there's always this sort of danger of a certain sort of like navel gazing solipsism when artists begin to like wax eloquent about art. I think that you kind of have to take some of what's said with a certain grain of salt. I think there's like stories that artists like to spin about the art making and the sort of like mythos of that for like a general audience. And I think that both films might be guilty of that to a certain degree. I think maybe Agony and the Ecstasy a little more so, which isn't to say that there isn't like some truth, like some real insight about the art making process that's presented in each. But that is like something that I was finding myself sort of aware of as I was watching these movies.
Yeah. Konchalovsky said that he didn't put scenes of Michelangelo making art because he thinks that's boring to show an artist making art in a movie. But I have to say, in the Agony and the Ecstasy, I think it's really cool how they really show you like the sheer physical exertion and toll that painting the Sistine Chapel
totally
had on Michelangelo.
And also how it was done. They tell us an awful lot about how to take a block of marble.
That's right. And that's another kind of art. You know, it's an art of a lower order. It's not a fine art, but like he spends a lot of time showing us how that feat is accomplished. And you know, it's a nice thing about both of the films is that you get a sense of, it's
like, why is that more interesting than showing Michelangelo actually painting?
Exactly. But so it sort of gives the lie to what he's saying. But like, but both films got me thinking about how, you know, these great works of art don't just sort of spring up from one person, and they certainly don't spring up out of nowhere. You know, that there's like a whole like ecosystem that exists behind these incredible accomplishments that, you know, nowadays are so often derided, you know, with like a sneer, you know, or like, oh, like white supremacy or something, you know, like ridiculous. I just, you know, I liked that.
I'm not a huge fan of artist biopics, so you know, it was interesting that you I mean, the Agony and the Ecstasy is one of the few that I find at least palatable. Although, again, watching it again, I found it a little slow. But that's also part of the age, right? There's again, the age is a period when they're developed a certain kind of filmmaking, and they just linger on it a little bit. I think if we look at some movies, you know, 20, 30 years from now, from this particular period, we'll look at some of the CGI things and realize that they like lingered on that. And we'll be like, why did they do that? Well, because they just developed it. It was super cool and they were playing with it. And I think
it's like, why is there so much nudity, so much more like random nudity in movies in the 70s and the 80s than now, even though now is probably a morally worse time? Like, it's because they could. They just got the ability to do it. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for doing so much background labor on this. I can't believe you went and watched Andrei Rublev just for this. These are all long movies, and that's a really long movie. So I'm very impressed.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. that's why no matter how many technical problems we were having, I was doing this today because I have watched hours and hours and hours of movies.
There's an even longer version. There's a director's cut.
Please don't do that.
It's like, I don't know how much longer.
Yeah. I can't take that much more mud. I just can't. Actually, there's some things I'd talk to you about in that movie. But anyway, no more of that. But it was that was long. No, it was great. It was really, really fun. And it was actually conveniently, I'm about to start teaching a course on the Sistine Chapel. So it was really, really helpful research for me. So everything sort of worked out perfectly, and I really had a good time watching them and kind of applying, you know, real attention to the movie. Plus I went to University of Chicago, so we always do homework.
Thanks everybody for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe. And if you like this podcast, I'm going to ask you this time to please share it with someone, email it to someone, post it on Facebook, whatever. But just help more people find this show. Thanks everybody. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.
This is Criteria,